Hello everyone. Or you. Just you watching this. Oh, give me a sec, let me try that again. Hello to everyone who has, or will, eventually watch this video. What you are about to see is an extensive piece dedicated to an unseen, yet unsung element of gaming. Before we start, I'd like to say a few things about the scope and significance of this project. This is entirely a work of passion, which I have had the pleasure, and the displeasure, of figuring out for the better portion of a year. It's been an interesting experience to say the least. And to say the most, I've been learning all of this as I go along. And I'm happy to share some of that work with you. It's difficult for me to say this, but this is the first video in a two-part series, as its scope has basically gotten completely out of hand. And I'd like to give the later half just as much love as I have with this one. Anyways, I can only hope you take something out of these, albeit personal, observations I have made on a subject that has truly captivated me. Alright, we can start the video now. The irony in the camera comes from how its significance hinges on its absolute lack of intrusion. As games tend to be regarded through their presentation in a current, busy gaming environment centered around player reception, the camera is non-existent in selling this fact, when it's really the thing that holds it all together. In the context of interactivity, what is being framed is far more important than what's in the frame itself, ironically enough, especially in the medium's current period of escalation, given the importance placed on the detail and scope of graphics. But this is an environment that could only emerge through an extensive, constant process of deciding how and why a scene should be seen within a contained perspective. As a player breaches the screen to engage a fabricated reality, and this tailored space is confronted by a casual chaos media consumption facilitates. When considering a game's content, it's easy to lose the prospect that all of it stays contained through meticulous, deliberate methods. Cameras are critical in supporting every aspect of a game. They rein in a virtual space, leaving it presentable, and more importantly, readable. They make or break certain experiences, to the point of changing its resounding reception. This is, entirely, due to the environment of gaming as it is today, which only exists through a foundation of trial and error. These windows into interactive environments evolve through a conversation between its contrasting angles of engagement. To understand what works, attempts have to be made. Defying this impenetrable barrier builds the medium into what it is today. The medium has always been addressed through two perceptions, ones that guide all creative pieces, but take on a new shape due to what interactivity comes to imply. The creator and the player live through each other, finding hardship due to the alternating expectations within their contained realities, which generates a constant conversation that learns to work against these differences, despite the apparent boundaries between them. If you notice the camera when playing a game, chances are, it's not very good at its job. Any difficulties that come from the limits of the camera, like needing to see something off screen, only for it to take its time when catching up with you, as it leaves you helpless while clipping behind any objects it comes across. All of this shows a resounding lack of communication. Basically, a game exists as a virtual environment first and foremost, where introducing the independent perspective of a player implements contrasting expectations. Both are isolated, resulting in opposing ideals. All of this is connected through the camera, which injects both realities into one another, and with this, its communication struggles to feel communicative. In this context, it's easy to give a game's camera tangibility, as it accumulates a presence that is melded with a player's subconscious perception, by, rather curiously, detaching into a separate entity entirely. This is because of the camera's adjacent role as an active contributor throughout a game. Despite its separation from the actions a player parallels through direct input, the distinct ability to manually reposition this perspective represents a fluidity in understanding virtual reality that interaction allows. A camera serves as the game's worlds. It encapsulates everything it's composed of, containing every obstacle, collectible, or subject worth considering. It's the essential gateway into a tailored experience. Anything working outside of this vision builds towards an understanding of the deliberate perception dictated by the frame. As virtual reality is defined, and then condensed into a specified perspective. These spaces are inhabited by the players that extend themselves onto predetermined avatars. The medium expects you to work in tandem with yourself, pitting an internal perception with one that has been imposed, alongside the unsteady composition offered by the moving screen. And as the significance of the camera shifts into a player's hands, this relationship develops, recontextualizing the possibilities of games. A steady progression in the frame's familiarity will come to be consciously applied, as, miraculously, these distinct inputs, meant to work against our singular perception of reality, find a sense of unity. I will be following the history of gaming as it gets more comfortable overcoming the barrier inherent in its form. It will become apparent that games are only as capable of elaborating on the intricacies of a virtual space, as much as an audience can interpret them. In the dawn of gaming, before the concept of the camera, reins on interaction were heavily placed through a tailored, static screen. Single-screen titles assured that everything you needed to see was in front of you. Due to their inherent simplicity, in both hardware limitations and a hazy understanding of the capabilities gaming could eventually achieve, games are designed to be condensed, so all the action happens on one screen, which establishes the medium's distinctions through its capacity for interactivity. I see this in the excessive use of screen wrap in many old games, a now novel mechanic that utterly shapes gameplay, reaffirming boundaries so heavily that a liminal, infinite space is made through restriction. When this can be challenged, it offers a blatant representation of how player input affects a game structure. Movement between screens offers different things, unseen objectives, eventual goals that are consciously out of reach, aspects that escape immediate attention. Luckily, contemporary hindsight allows us to consider past advancements through the reductions, giving us the ability to pinpoint these elements that arise between designer and gamer more overtly. The immediate difference comes from a player's control in when these cues occur, though, at this point, the ball is still stuck in a developer's court, implying a constant pace through movement between specified screens. Early gaming prioritizes its discovery of interactivity and the implications of this, serving as a gateway into deeper ideas of how a subject not only engages with, but controls a world through their inputs. Players can choose when they confront certain screens, influencing how they address them in the process. Unlike film, there is just enough liberty in a viewer's options, despite the reality laid out for them, an aspect that will only escalate with time. The first major leap in camera capability comes from the scroll, and its implications on how control is distributed from developer to player. A quaint notion these days, that was a technological marvel in the early age of the medium. The scroll is an early instigator into effectively contemplating the major distinctions of gaming as a medium, transgressing cinema's purpose of the tailored screen until the space in and around it is considered through the possibility of independent movement it proposes. Scrolling in itself expects a lot from the beginning, imposing a view that spans past what can be naturally seen. There is a physical process that drags a subject on, needing them to both acknowledge a past perspective while accepting a new, encroaching image. This implies a conflict beyond the void inherent in a camera's limitations, an unknown that will inevitably be discovered, with undefined obstacles that will need to be faced, sometimes even understood, before it can exist within the frame's perspective. The gaming industry's evolution can be tied to this instability of the screen, once there's a set path a player is placed on, rather than a series of confined spaces. What is laid out for them to uncover defines the larger experience being constructed in the frame's manual movement, and how the player naturally fights this facilitates the medium's growth. When the medium is able to break off from the single screen, interaction starts to propose a visual sense of movement throughout a virtual reality, one that represents a more extensive space past the frame's constant limitation. The environment of engagement that arises due to our two previously observed perspectives now takes a tangible presence. This encapsulates the prevalent, yet hidden area that resides just beyond the screen's set borders. Simply put, Each side is split between where they allocate their investment. A developer naturally remains within a wider scope of the world's creation. Everything a game is, and without elaborating on the exhausting process of development, everything that composes this specified perception is a part of this creative viewpoint. Which means the focus of the frame is utterly intentional, and tied heavily with the engagement of a player. As a player, on the other hand, confronts this with a greater passiveness apparent in consuming media, only remaining invested in the game itself. They more or less abide by the limitations of the frame, proposed through a developer's extensive consideration of this. Although, they do remain ignorant of these apparent borders, and tend to see them more as suggestions, so they can be overcome, or outright ignored given a player's own investment in a virtual reality. This lack of understanding presents the issues in manually applying focus that a constantly moving image deals with. Framing static instances that a player works through fluidly, which results in an interactivity that always opposes a defined perspective. So, the unknown elements a player challenges come from the clashing this subjective border produces, enforcing necessary limitations that feel less motivated from a player's distanced perspective. With time, the dominant presence of this full virtual scope will constantly be deconstructed by the passive demands of a player. Its evolution will always be evident in how the space is utilized, or circumvented, to guide focus within a frame across the unseen space surrounding it. For a brief moment, movement could be lost at the mercy of the screen. As the player went on their way, the screen would trail into new horizons, but with it, sealing the fate of anything that came before it. It's a strange, conscious decision for a developer to make, limiting traversal in such a way that locks aspects of their work in a solitary moment of gameplay. As if letting players know that every frame is in service of what's ahead, rather than what's been seen, so that it's constantly swept past them. Of course, it was more than likely a reluctant necessity through limitations at the time, which would become a greater experimentation that was necessary to discover how games can progress, while finding a system to rely on. Mainly, how should perception be tailored, while keeping in mind an alternate party with differing motives? When is it essential for something to be on screen? And when should it be guaranteed that something remains out of sight? Cutting off portions of the screen during gameplay tends to create unseen complications, emphasizing this miscommunication between developers and players within these limits a frame imposes. But it was something worth trying, as it presented a new relationship between game and player, shaping the experience between static frames they themselves created. It gives us a good idea of how control was still kept in the hands of a developer, while opening the way for player experimentation through less rigid shifts of the screen. Each instance happens continuously, becoming a different contained scenario with each step, while offering players the ability to move around this fixed space in the process. The original Super Mario Bros. Is curious in that regard, especially with how the series evolves through its defiance of this original philosophy. There's something inherently visceral about hitting a block and finding a mushroom, then watching it roll over into non-existence after Mario moves just an inch to the right. It creates a melancholy feeling from the player's perspective. There's no turning back. Any mistakes like this are from a higher power. It just is what it is. This is by design. Designed through limitations, of course, but it gives a window into a reductive quality that can only emerge from the act of playing and learning from games. We know these limitations are less than favorable, not only because the game was made this way, but because the view from the outside offered by players discovers how their interests lay beyond these borders. As these restrictions to perception alter a game's entire relation, this opens space for contemplation. It's funny when considering these long-standing elements of the Mario series, which seem to have always been intended to work from outside a player's field of vision. Mushrooms escape to goad a player into chasing them. Koopa shells are shot off into any direction, and serve a threat once they're out of sight, since, somehow, they still exist. All of this points in the direction that games will have to offer players levels of control that begin to go beyond a player's projection through the other of the avatar. Working past this to absorb a virtual area's information in ways that motivate action mentally, beyond this physical traversal. Games progress alongside a familiarity of the camera, addressing it as this component that shapes it completely. How its space is moved throughout can start to imply more complexity, and the screen continues to challenge through its incorporation of movement beyond a set path, offering vertical traversal, among other forms of extensive screen shifting actions, that propose a more open range of space. The act of creating within these new boundaries has developed the ways they are considered going forward, finding a philosophy built on the distinctions of interactivity, as it separates from an uncomfortable closeness with film's manipulation of the frame.
Super Mario Brothers 3!
While games hold a lot of structural comparisons to film, being a visual medium that fabricates an intentional perception of a world, there are a surprising amount of closer similarities to the stage play. The difference being that things need to exist beyond this space as active contributors, working independently until inevitably being framed. Sort of standing around, waiting for the action to get to them, instead of occupying a dedicated space. But the openness implied by interactivity was still very linear, with the camera always moving as you did, and very little compromise, despite the interest that clearly extended past the central character. Games are built around the barriers defined by developers, and the control of the camera comes to prove this as it evolves. There's an apparent disconnect during this time, especially when considering the game creators on the fringes of the industry. A good camera is invisible. A bad one makes you realize how much is invisible to you. The main crux of the camera's struggled history comes from what a developer wants a player to see, and how it clashes with what a player feels they need to know. This assumption is never sound, creating a disconnected relationship behind games creation and its consumption. When factoring in the heavily obstacle-based nature of early games, something that's only known to be an issue once it's on screen, or can only be reacted to when it comes into this defined frame, results in the medium's most frustrating moments. It all depends on the perspectives between studio design and player flexibility. The fact that this not only greatly influences a design philosophy, but also took as long as it did to be properly acknowledged, compels me to no end. How can something feel so obvious to a player when faced with certain challenges that immediately feel unfair, without similarly being considered by its creators? Well, from the start, a game's camera is consistently addressed as a technological necessity. When you begin from a position so critical of these mechanics, it's hard to place yourself back into the shoes of someone unaware of their inner workings. A developer's perspective, which is so distant from an original intention, familiarity changes how design is addressed, down to the ways a camera follows with a specific usage in mind. First and foremost, a game needs to be seen, to a point where considering how this is received tends to feel overlooked. As long as it can be read by a player, it's fine, right? Obviously, this isn't the case for one reason or another, as design is constantly thwarted by the frame's restrictions. Readability has a range of effectiveness. Given the complexities inherent in the medium, there's a lot more analysis that goes into split-second understandings of each situation. What something is, how it will affect them, not to mention what goes on beyond that. As the whole frame is absorbed at once, their attention is stretched thin. It takes an added awareness of how anything a player can't see is just as important. How a game is structured needs to revolve around a curious sense of timing, accommodating when a player will confront something, beyond how they are meant to. Slowly, laboriously, this system is tweaked in the only way it can be, with a constant struggle in setting up digital worlds through its specified framing, as it progressively alters the presence of traversal from an outside observer. It's a process that's only available from both perspectives, in their conversation of what works and what doesn't work.
Introducing the next generation from Nintendo.
Even as games get more advanced between generations, cameras would be a consistent conundrum. It wasn't only from a technological standpoint either, even if the consoles could draw from more power, bringing with them a new potential in creation. Once this barrier of confronting the next step forward was crossed, the games themselves remained consistent, while implying more room for experimentation. The same sort of product was still being made, and its capabilities, alongside its limitations, continued to be considered. As it continues a consistent structure from its earlier definition in the last generation, an understanding of the media could allow it to develop more than it would need to be reworked. Its contemporary capability is founded on an awareness to previous limitations, meaning that the idea of the screen can not only start to stabilize, but can be consciously emphasized in its forced sense of focus. These elements that began to feel like a given, avatars and their traversal, obstacles and their defiance, were reshaped by the screen and its presence of containing these elements, while influencing a larger environment of interaction. Essentially, the industry could pick up where it left off, resulting in a vantage point for unlocking the developing medium's new potential, working within its distinct, interactive elements. The screen was acknowledged in ways that could be escalated, perpetuating it past its prior expectations, allowing a more common growth through the frame, rather than a reduction. This results in titles that continue to hold up due to their grasp on these remaining systems on a fundamental level. Yet, looking back on the distant self, which works within these developed spaces, this isn't as straightforward as it seems, as no definitive formula is safe from the impersonal player who is burdened by the frame, which could not guarantee a removal of the screen's dormant frustrations. All of this follows about as natural of an evolution as you can get, working between generations of consumer products. But its consistency meant stepping past it, and deciding on what would continue to compel players as they engage beyond its intended space. Finding what worked was a strange process that can only ever emerge through a reception of what was done differently. And with the legacy of the generation before it, a firmer grasp is placed on a player's transference into the space through the playable character. All while this direct connection requires context that reaches past these easily assumed borders. All of these factors come to represent how this period practically exhausts the contemporary extent of the medium, refining its experience until finding the confidence to push it to its absolute limits. The mastery of 2D games starts to consider the screen and its use as a movable camera, one that works with intentions independent of a player, since it has always subconsciously existed with little input. Addressing its active contribution of establishing a virtual environment allows its effects on interactivity to be effectively honed in. The relation of a player's input and their perception can start to separate. Elaborating on new ways the engagement between them defines the form of gameplay. An avatar can now fulfill its role as an extension of the screen's perception, physically peeking along the edges of its frame for a better external view. But nothing could rival the deliberate challenges established within the screen, so the angle of this engagement is played with, offering a new sense of depth and perspective that alters outlooks relative to the screen's static perception. All of which needs to exist from beyond a centralized figure, one that a player imprints with through interactivity. This relation with a player that reaches the developmental side begins to trust a complacency with the screen's traversal, allowing it to push boundaries in its overall depiction, to begin challenging what has been expected of it. Developers utilize their dominance through the cohesion of framing, as they influence changes that converge its perception of reality alongside its interactivity. This implication of the avatar will consistently work alongside the drastic shifts experienced across the medium's history, offering a clear representation of how a player's singular perspective structures the wider scope of a virtual world's design. How it affects the worlds, and how the world is affected through its traversal, will build onto this stark relationship between player and developer, creating more intricacy within it over time, as the importance behind an avatar's visibility, alongside its surrounding invisibilities, is built upon. Differing levels of focus on the playable character between games is representative of a conversation taking place to discover a supposed sweet spot, to reliably pin down where a character should be centralized within a defined space. Their essential role as an extension of the player is challenged by the equally essential area of engagement enveloping it. After some trial and error, it becomes apparent that there will always have to be a consistent, ever-shifting need to skew a player over, mainly to oppose the direction they are moving in. Movements are created in the screen that feel subtle through player investment in order to alleviate the shock of unseen obstacles, offering the space to effectively analyze what's ahead, while assuring enough is kept in focus, emphasizes two things: that the medium must accommodate the constant, unknowable movement of a player, and that it will always come off as an instability, due to the distinct forces it creates interactions between. This skew can be applied more effectively with titles invested in redefining virtual spaces traversal, pushing its supposed boundaries in its tailoring of perspective. Games must become more advanced to offer other kinds of experiences when working with constructed environments, reshaping the medium in ways meant to break a mold of hesitancy, one that develops over it in its growing expectations as a product. For the format to truly evolve, its preconceptions have to be deconstructed, even if this meant destroying a familiar foundation, so something new could be built in its place, progressing the sort of conversation that bypasses the barrier facing creators and players. Donkey Kong Country is a title that accurately represents an established formula's evolution, by acknowledging the ways in which its moving parts wholly shape its experience. The prospect of the obstacle, and the implications provided by its specified enemy placement, exaggerate past design prospects, to consciously restructure how its confrontation is addressed. The game is heavily obstacle-based. Its challenges are laid out in such a straightforward way that whatever a player needs to confront is framed to fully contain it, or to set up whatever might come through the screen next, putting less emphasis on movement between set pieces. Levels themselves are designed around obstacles in mind, themed to specific challenges or mechanics, something that is present in previous titles, but to a less engaged degree. Mario World places enemies along your path, but in Donkey Kong Country, those enemies are your path. These elements are offered a heightened sense of significance, one that makes the process of moving further across the screen a more personally interactive experience, creating a level of investment that has been unseen in prior titles, promoting a, sometimes unstable, sort of unity in each of its moving elements. What lies beyond the segments created by the screen are considered more intently, to the point where players are influenced to also constantly consider what lies ahead. It motivates a certain style of navigation, reliant on the expectations built upon its challenges, stringing together predetermined elements into a larger, cohesive environment, one that works beyond the closed-in perspective of a player, to a varying degree of seamlessness. This conversation it produces escalates with the game's sequels, where gameplay elements are taken to a logical extreme that can only be achieved by acknowledging a growth in players the original had accomplished, by addressing the ways in which design had previously been handled, and how it was progressed through. Elaboration is a necessary step, as it is conscious of its past level design to an extent that it naturally adapts to it, as a sort of foundation, offering room to open up its structure further, which allows the constraints of a virtual space to become more reliant on a player's intuition through interaction, rather than a straightforward progression. This results in a style of traversal that isn't afraid to give players the room to confront diverse obstacles, leading to more abstract concepts that are coded in a past connection produced through an engagement with the original. A structure that is inherent in the frame's confinement is now shown to be enhanced through an awareness to past convention, which is apparent in the changes that Donkey Kong Country 2 makes to separate from its predecessor, not only elaborating on its original development of the gameplay structure, but offering new aspects meant to engage this connection of game and player through the frame more intensively. A player's movement through its specified virtual reality can now be given a closer look, similarly starting with a grounded perspective of its capabilities, in order to push the extent of player interaction. There's a very clear transition of expectations, as the limitations of an avatar are challenged due to its past production. Now that there's a foundational understanding of what can be achieved, alternate levels of engagement can exist. Exploration is elaborated on through incentivizing a player's personal deconstruction of the game's own boundaries. Defined virtual spaces are now expanded upon to accommodate the constantly curious perspective a player brings, resulting in a greater sense of depth in level design. Rewards take on a much more prominent role, due to their stronger sense of satisfaction towards a distanced figure of the player. A trust starts to emerge within the conflict of the camera, resulting in times where its subconscious intuition can be ignored by both perspectives, for the sake of provoking an interest in its very defiance. This results in a constant sense of experimentation within the extents of a constructed space, which even occasionally bypasses what has been so heavily familiarized by the borders of the frame. It's one of those shining examples that proves how design influences play, how play influences design, and how the medium's presentation of a virtual world is meant to continuously advance ideals of connectivity as the cycle goes on, pushing its supposed extents further and further each time. But I shouldn't get ahead of myself here. This relationship was still far from perfect, and for the most part, it would have to stay this way. The medium almost lends itself to these sorts of conflicts, and the path to progress meant both contrasting parties could only keep butting heads, so to speak. Yoshi's Island, on the other hand, elevates this to another level through its elaboration on the ways a player moves and interacts with elements of the world, alongside presenting the world itself. It offers a much more diverse range of movement, and a sense of momentum is given in a way that incentivizes multiple angles of confronting static situations. Its virtual environment can feel like a realized space, which similarly affects the screen's usage as a camera, allowing for differently designed structures to its levels, obstacles or mechanics in themselves, shaping the space of the screen in new and exciting ways by placing a new sense of attention on their presence. As it differently affects an avatar, its engaged design implies a sense of movement here beyond the original lean, which the game brings you through naturally. Yoshi, as an avatar a player imprints on, is even lost in the priority of the screen sometimes, simply to consider the ways in which this may flesh out how an area is experienced, giving you a stronger feel for the space that continues to encompass a field of understanding. Although it works beyond a perceivable space, the game's condensed labyrinths also consider the essential presence of confinement, enclosing the character's movements, to question how its traversal changes when limited. Yoshi's Island was definitely ahead of its time in some regards, handling both horizontal and vertical movement flawlessly by prioritizing the character's readability. The gameplay is at a constant pace, assuring it can keep up with any interactive actions of the player, while offering the experience intended in its creation, always nudging a player in the right direction, as the spaces they confront freely shift with an unprecedented confidence, even imploring certain decisions that won't return in the cultural consciousness for quite some time. It's the product of a constantly improving relationship occurring in game development, leading to a defiance of the rigidness assumed by the enclosed space of the screen, and proposing how this space will spread past what has been assumed of the central figure of a player. The progression of the medium has resulted in a deeper contemplation of the avatar, where developers look more intently at their connection through a distanced perception of the player. Doing so produces a sense of 2D traversal, as an all-encompassing, undefined environment, surpassing the screen to consider it as a full digital world. Once the screen is no longer seen as a limitation, but something that builds a perceived experience, it can even exist as an element of the game itself, embodying the ways game design is both unconsciously and subconsciously worked with. This is what separates a past obligation from a present challenge. There's a limit 2D work pushes itself into, with only so much that can be seen on a flat surface, or implied within a game's flat reality. In order to progress in audience reliance and access new complexities within player engagement, gaming is soon thrown against a rough, untrained terrain. Once again it will be broken down, but this time, it might never build itself back up, as the situation between medium, maker, and player only evolves further. This control starts to slip out of a developer's hands in the encroaching age of 3D, where the addition of the third dimension feels about as unexpected in perception, as well as execution. With such a broad leap away from the comforts a 2D space now brought, it's no wonder this transition ended up being so redefining for the medium. It had to be. Not only due to its complete disruption of past ideals, but through the ways in which interactivity needed new applications. A straightforward structure was no longer reasonable, due to its immediate implications on movement. Its complete disjointment has majorly contributed to the added presence of the camera. As it becomes a physical dilemma both sides need to learn to deal with, it is something that starts to exist as a constant component of the game, as it is seen and played, which is now placed into a player's unwilling hands. Before this point, the camera couldn't even be considered as such. Compared to the way we see it today, there was always some level of control. But now it exists as a physical component, meant to manually frame a perception of virtual space. Here we see the rough patch that would border the past of the screen with a current similarity to the camera, where it starts to become applicable alongside a grounded sense of reality. As this range of sight starts to become a sphere of consciousness, it produces an enveloping environment that shapes the space of the screen with more intent, straining a predetermined sense of focus through a constructed reality that now completely reflects physical traversal, where it may now imply a full realization of movement that can't be as rigidly controlled. Its unknown potential forces both parties to unsuccessfully grapple with the capabilities of the spatial manipulation. The introduction of the 3D space brings with it the implication of a parallel environment, as it runs into more immediate, intimate similarities with reality. Due to this, a base level assumption shifts. What is shown, and what wants to be seen, varies with the supposed ease of turning your head. Getting the full picture becomes a tall order, in ways it never had before. An aspect that felt so natural through developer input gains an entire aura of nuance in the liberties site proposes. This produces a foundational struggle, where aspects of a virtual reality need to stay unseen, while implying their existence constantly, requiring an inherent skill in addressing the intentions of a framed environment that wouldn't be mastered for years to come. This is due to how traversal through space starts to require a physical application, which immediately expects an audience to accommodate multiple perspectives, ones that mainly contrast their own gaze to continuously keep the unseen in mind, incorporating and retaining their elements constantly, forcefully transcending their once simple perception by now tasking players to engage with its spatial awareness, alongside the interactive elements they extend onto an avatar. It wasn't enough to simply walk ahead and hope for the best, as games now need to be produced with an underlying presumption of freedom. Movement and perception start to seem much more stark from one another, in an utterly disrupting sort of way. In this segment, I will be emphasizing the 3 foundations of 3D games I have noticed, as they materialize through this defining period of the medium's history. Each addresses the ways in which focus shifts through the physical traversal of virtual space, requiring other ways to enforce the frame. The extension of implied space, due to the limitations inherent in perceiving 3D space, accentuates the previous climate of conflict both sides engage with. As all of these structures of presentation embody a loss of implied confinement, they represent how implementing restriction, through the frame's prominence, produces distinctive experiences. Free movement takes place in an extensive space, still inherently contained by technical or structural setbacks, but the point here is that nothing is necessarily out of a player's reach. Dropping them into a defined area, and tasking them to traverse it with the means a developer employs. Visualizing an open space they can move throughout, which goes as far as an avatar's defined capabilities can take it. But this freedom also means that players will naturally struggle with what isn't available for them to see, locking perception through controls that mainly clash with an openness assumed in free movement. Guided movement keeps a player constantly contained in ways that are always apparent, reducing a range of access meant to restrict players into confronting its constructed sense of reality in ways that are not absolutely limiting, but enough to intrinsically direct players, either removing the uncertainty in the screen's extent, or making it more blatant in the directions a player personally applies. There is usually no question about what lies past the frame, since it is designed to move a player through a set path. Flat movement enforces an even more rigid line of progress, enveloping a familiar linearity in a constructed virtual reality, following new motivations that arise in the medium's growing lack of limits. This is where 2D movement is made mandatory. Unlike guided experiences, players are unable to move with the sense of freedom proposed by 3D's empty space. No matter the context, the heavily defined spaces of 2D gaming are effectively distanced, turning games towards a philosophy of throwing an outside perspective into designed spaces with less implicit restrictions. The presence of these environments changes, but the distance of a player does not, meaning that a past guidance that is difficult to obtain will never properly accommodate player decisions. Too much power is given to the chaos of the distant other, where the gentle leadings of structure would be hopelessly diminished. For this reason, players have to be casted off, left forcefully adapting to newly discovered developments as studios utilize them, all while the security they could offer was effectively useless, still stumbling from a past process of keeping 2D games well-read. The added dimension tacks on a plethora of challenges in the player-developer conversation. A player becomes split between an avatar and controlling their perception, conflicting with a familiar engagement by placing entirely new responsibilities, which now need to be tied to personal input. Interacting with a game becomes a climate of deep investment, as it requires full spatial awareness. This means that visualizing what remains just beyond the fringe of the screen's extent is complicated further. Now that readability is tied to a manual interactivity made distinct from movement, elements that encroach into this field of perception become far more disorienting, especially now, where design fails to find ways to confidently limit interactivity, where this now amplifies the room for error, while subsequently being unable to repress its freedom without breaching a familiar control and perception. In the hands of the player, input implies an absolute perspective of the game's reality, so when they're subjected to boundaries that oppose this, things become frustrating. These early limitations arise due to a lack of understanding behind the kind of conversations games now create. A struggle to understand these systems, alongside their uncertain execution, creates utter confusion from both sides. Within the new complexities the medium instills, a mutual relation would have to blossom through this apparent clash when imposing a contained perspective. How can we begin to understand movement in a 3D environment when relying on a viewpoint that can't be assumed most of the time? Uncertainty undefines the medium, leaving everyone attempting to consider a new relationship and its effects on its future. The ways that games were played had to adapt to survive. An obvious example of this shift comes from comparing the 2D and 3D platformer, where a player's next move from one obstacle to another would change fundamentally. With the ways that games shift alongside their amount of dimensions, a player's options progresses as well. Can a technological approach truly predict the choices a player will make when they're given a range of space, rather than a set path? Even when considering the specified challenge at hand, they're given a much more extensive range of solutions, most of which would even be left unconsidered. That's just the level of openness implied by 3D spaces, where much more empty space exists in every instance. Or at the very least, a larger space of less defined action always exists, making it difficult to assume where a player might go, despite a focus through intentional design. This might explain why the linear, goal-based system was sidelined during this time, other than a more apparent consumer expectation of distinct experiences, since, as an industry, it was more concerned about the ways in which 3D would separate itself from the past. Broader, objective-based titles allow players to roam around while giving each action an importance that doesn't take away from the discovery of clearly defined goals. Even missteps meant a readily available path could be recreated, or something else could be discovered instead. This assists in alleviating the frustrations obvious in the new range of failure that became possible. While not the most clinical answer, Super Mario 64 is the essential, introductory 3D title, in more ways than one, establishing an openness that the medium now needed to rebuild both sides of its conversation. From beginning to end, its design intends to develop a resilience to the form's new issues, both offering room to improve or explore during the struggle, while pushing players to strengthen their capabilities within the uncertain environments. This even extends on to the development itself, where it presents vulnerabilities that will also need to be worked through. Serving this role as a new point of inception for the medium, its issues, as they only feel more blatant with time, are necessary when reshaping how these things will be addressed going forward, which materializes in little caveats across the game that represent developmental assumptions and emerging player struggles. while it does get so much right on its first try. Mario 64's blemishes provide a better look into how change was handled, and how it was struggled through at first. It serves this purpose as this essential first step, while leaving some room to contemplate its possibilities, as players adapt to its foreign format, showing the radical differences in structure through an application of perception, to give a new foundation to the genre itself. As it accommodates uncertainties, while pushing previously familiar extents of the medium, plainly addressing what must be expected of its audience, so it can see its own faults in the process. It goes as far as to personify its camera, symbolically introducing its players to their capability of controlling a reality's positioning, while keeping this simple to grasp. If we give this concept another glance, we could even question the deeper significance this serves. We have already been dropped into the virtual environment, separated from this diegetic grounding. It comes off as a necessary distinction, representing the layered relationship a player has stumbled into by engaging with the game itself, effectively taking an outright abstract concept and dwelling into it further than any game has done past this point, conditioning this foreign concept of focus on what is practically two independent subjects, because, to be fair, it starts to feel bizarre when compared to a past generation's far more hands-off approach to perception. To properly teach players why Mario remains the central avatar, despite the constant cognitive motions made to address their adjacent gaze, the Lakitu Bros excuse sort of explains away the technical complexity behind it. It never feels as though two characters are being used, even if by knowledge, this continues to be the case throughout the entire game. Because this is understood from the beginning, never elaborated on, and slowly sinks into a space of familiarity, as a player becomes heavily accustomed, just by playing and practicing as they go along. Many aspects of its design can essentially be boiled down into this new priority, where the player-game connection feels far more overcomplicated through the camera's added separation. 64 works to make this seem like a second nature, as players work within the game. The fluidity of Mario, which tends to transcend the minimalist virtual world he traverses, embodies the priority placed in regaining a personal connection, despite these new distinctions. Mario's range of movement is so extensive that the simplicity of each stage offers new situations to simultaneously ease new players, while pushing the supposed capabilities of the avatar. Mario 64's importance as a transition between forms that reconsiders how its previous elements are utilized cannot be understated. It accumulates many new philosophies, establishing the distinctions that define a 3D genre, working within the old format, while heavily restructuring it, mainly through an awareness to the deeper investment full camera control implies. There are a lot of changes here that must have felt very risky at first, but by now, just feel natural due to the elements that still remain a constant through their successful execution. Very physically altering levels, a concept used to define going from point A to point B, with obstacles and predetermined challenges in between, into stages, where a broader range of elements encapsulates a contained space, and goals are distributed more evenly, to the point where traversing to certain areas can feel like a reward on its own, which offers a closer conversation between a user's expectations and the potential limitations a position of creation proposes, resulting in a more spacious, less defined presence that works as a sort of net for certain actions, promoting a relationship between player and stage, instead of imposing expectations in the level format. For example, if you fall off a bridge in Wobb's Fortress, you can walk from the pond to its back, find a pole, and scale it from there. Even with these attempts to settle players into the new style, it's much more likely that a system will work against a player through camera control, unable to accommodate the actions they could take against an intended one. A majority of these mistakes emerge through the camera's own inability to appeal certain expectations in relation to immediate player needs, as their fluidity through a distanced perspective creates misalignments that make this personal control feel limiting. If we go back to this same bridge, it becomes apparent that it isn't necessarily a guaranteed action with the resources a player is offered, as the camera never really seems to concern itself with the level of precision a player actually needs, moving between specific points, which it cuts between with every turn of the stick. This has been done beforehand for a very specific reason, as it attempts to bring players into the new style without offering them a complete sense of control, which at the time was very intimidating. Yet, when it's set up to be applied by the player, it doesn't seem capable enough to understand how to deal with these situations. It brings into question how focus itself is valued, when displaying an environment is a priority first, and an advantage later. We might think crossing the bridge is our ultimate goal, when in reality, design needs to now address that everything but this could occur, as its presentation provides us with what's beyond this. So for a moment, let's consider the intimidating composition of a constantly moving image. Film fixes this through its limitations of framing, as every component works in service of enforcing where focus should be led. This is something games don't have. Constant movement is enforced, as a virtual space is interacted with. A mystifying amount of traversal now exists. A reality must be established and moved throughout by the guidance of design. The figure of the avatar then becomes the natural placement for a distanced perspective, centralizing virtual space around it, and surrounding it in a fluid sort of focus, meant to establish a player's distinct movement within the frame's constructed space. The significance of an avatar represents a growing priority in player action, accommodating more intricacy by prioritizing an avatar's interaction. For as much as a world can be framed, and how apparent its hidden elements are, the fluid figure of the avatar is essential in defining how a game's information is registered. An avatar works throughout a virtual space, independently of a perception shaped by the camera, where it processes the supposed confinements of the frame. Games have to get used to giving players control over the camera, trusting they can make certain decisions on their own in its placement. Due to this, many old titles are unsure how to enforce this demand, so more often than not, players need to step back, shape the camera, and then continue. Nothing is more indicative of this than the scramble to accommodate the camera, which physically shifts or forcefully demands certain changes. There's almost a reluctance baked into many early games, an uncertainty of which buttons could be spared, or which can have double meanings under certain circumstances, especially as the games themselves needed to consider new styles of movement. It was a pretty precarious time. Look at how it warped the common controller. If this isn't enough of an example that 3D was a huge shakeup, I don't know what else to say. Even in the inevitable experimental phase of throwing two joysticks on a controller, it remained an elusive connection to make. Realizing that this was never immediately understood can be fairly sobering. A game like Ape Escape simply incorporated an extra stick into its moveset, relegating the camera to the rigid guidance of the right and left triggers. Alien Resurrection was lambasted for its decision to map a player's movement and their view as separate sticks. Something so familiar to us by now, which just wasn't understood until an audience could be settled into it. Detracting the player between two entities, an avatar and their vision, produces intriguing results. In such a chaotic time, these questions shape the kinds of experiences creators think players might want. What does a game want a player to see? How does it want to be seen? And is this enjoyable? How this freedom expressed by player input is taken into account comes to affect the nature of a virtual reality. Players start to shape their engagement through an environment's willingness to utilize the true extent of the medium, constantly reshaping its form due to its lack of limitations, which provides the unexpected benefit of defining boundaries. An avatar then starts to take on new connotations, ones that branch into a variety of game styles that require differing levels of user input. When input promotes a broader range of access, spaces are tailored through a minimalism proposed by a lack of linearity, while setting more extensive boundaries on control gives designers a flexibility in both presentation and structure by enforcing a guided experience. Limitations breed into new expectations, developing assumptions meant to reshape the genre through its new complexities, creating forms of specificity that result in new environments which closely account for the constraints of the avatar, and how this creates the experience of a virtual space, while also looking past what can conventionally be seen, as it can be similarly interacted with. The emerging period of 3D gaming would work as the foundation for many strong systems that have been refined to perfection by today, and a few more that were thankfully snuffed out by a sort of Darwinism through reception. Much like how the style of games changed with the shift in digital environments, The importance of the camera comes with its own segmentation into distinct genres. Gameplay itself can be modified through what choices are made to place a viewer's perspective into a predefined space. First person naturally parallels an assumed viewpoint, placing players directly into the skull of a playable character, one they are now tasked with closely integrating into. Movement is tied absolutely to view, logically progressing the imprinting process until it parallels the extent of an actual gaze. While this could benefit gameplay through its ease of assumption, changes to the system could prove to be more severe. A responsiveness implied by this framing inevitably feels limiting. Accounting for a specific reaction time at first feels unachievable, as an avatar will always contrast a player's natural capabilities. The action of turning around can be made too effortless, resulting in constant, disorienting corrections, or this can be given too much personal input, leaving players to sluggishly drag their vision instead, making what is unseen feel painfully apparent as something attacks you from behind. Both aspects emphasize the disconnect between input and perspective, representing how bringing both together tends to just drag them further apart. Some games rectify this issue by telling a player what they should see, and that's it, guiding them with a restrictive camera to reinstate an expectation around how obstacles need to be confronted. This is much more deliberate than earlier examples, effectively doubling down on old expectations when confining a player's view to an intended space, especially when contrasting a few titles that make these constraints more intentional, while also offering some negative space within their controlled designs, leaving the area for experimentation, and allowing the unpredictability in virtual spaces, while enforcing a kind of linearity. A win-win scenario. 2.5, however, mirrors its predecessors directly to alleviate certain anxieties in discovering the third dimension, rerouting gameplay into a heavily familiarized system. This genre definitely takes advantage of the overwhelming range of space available to it, but does so with the hesitance of familiar design. It'll twist and turn on a rigid path to emphasize how intensive an investment of space has become, but all of which is imposed with the benefit of constraint, while never encouraging an apparent presence of movement past a single dimension. This certainly helps to avoid contributing to the medium struggling period, as it proves to be much safer when working with what has succeeded in the past, rather than what could be seen as contrary to the medium's past. Recreations like this start to feel necessary, once the original 2D form starts to hold foundations beyond the medium's inherent structure. What it had represented comes to contrast what is now possible. No longer the norm, games would be labeled alongside their style of framing, inadvertently defining a series through its allocation of focus, to the point of rewriting past assumptions, as an idea of how a franchise is perceived becomes an essential question. There's a reason why the transition to 3D has been such a widely revered subject after all. You're making something into what it isn't, and how that works tends to rely solely on the strength of an original concept, rather than what has been expected of it beforehand, which was all it could have been at one point. Taking on this status of the 3D genre meant fitting into its new definition, or reinforcing a past structure, despite its waning complacency. Kirby's first attempt at 3D, with crystal shards, would emphasize the conflict faced on a wider scale within the medium that would keep its formula consistent for decades later, since anything other than this couldn't be considered a Kirby game. So instead, the extent in which linear movement takes place is pushed, offering unique angles meant to emphasize the added dimension. Yet, the rigidness of the frame represents a tether to the past, which is now much more apparent in the freedoms possible in a virtual space. This contrast makes its imposed limitations feel all the more limiting. Crystal Shards is exemplary of this fight to survive in an unstable perception of the medium, where keeping the core of a franchise meant continuing to abide rules that no longer applied, purposefully defying this by simply transitioning its past into a 3D space, as the only alternative is seeking out another style that will inevitably alienate its previous appeal, creating something that only resembled it in appearance, if even. As this mechanically defines the series, such a situation would come to define the direction of countless classic titles. As 3D defies all preconceptions, prior beliefs would have to be shed completely. making way for explorations on what a series even represents without its subjective perspective. Despite the visual qualities that strengthen the association with a virtual world, a sense of engagement through the specified perception of tailored movement truly labels it. By this logic, many kinds of games only exist due to this deconstruction of the format, where linearity is only as much of a suggestion as a developer enforces. Once the contemplation of this new interactive space settles, we see more subjects engaged with the foundation this creates. Where limitations are wholly imposed, they can theoretically be manipulated in the intentions an experience sets out to achieve, becoming a sort of resource that can be applied. Acknowledging the presence of the frame and its effects on perception produces very intriguing results. Finally, taking inspiration from film to some extent, it can be an effective resource for developers to work within the confines of the screen instead, taking advantage of the ways in which spaces are seen through a specific gaze to progress how this is familiarized. All of which produces an interesting pocket of history, where the limitations of the camera are honed in to create unique, extensive experiences by playing with the supposed frames of the screen, treating the singular gaze of the player as a resource when constructing certain spaces that produce a picture larger than what can be achieved at the moment. Singular screens manage to make a comeback, due to an ease and effectiveness that could only exist in a time just before the true extent of the medium could be envisioned. Movement can be made to feel much more significant through designing 3D planes as flat, implying far more in the distanced outlook of a player. In deliberately shaping 3D spaces down into the restrictions of 2D, this builds towards an illusion that is subconsciously believed, even occasionally working alongside 3D spaces, to create a fuller experience through the frame's influence. As these assumptions we have covered about a virtual reality's framing can be escalated into entirely tailored spaces, once the new presence of the medium is thoroughly understood. This is the logical extreme of a relationship between player and game, as traversal itself is deconstructed through player intentions. This reality is whatever can be made of it, as there is an inherent flexibility in player believability, especially when these kinds of methods leave entire areas more readable with their specified spaces. There's a definitive advantage to limitation being used within the shifting presence of the 3D age, as crafting these contained spaces strengthens specified truths imposed by design intentions, all of which presents the malleability in a player as an outside observer, as presenting exceptionally deliberate spaces not only benefits gameplay, but a feeling that it is meant to evoke, something that transcends the medium's past capabilities. Resident Evil is an important contributor to this growing form of restrictive camera gameplay, although it's to such an extreme degree from previous examples that it provides a new angle entirely. It is composed of these singular, stark frames, where utilizing flat images paradoxically fleshes out how the space is presented to a greater extent. While this belief of offering greater readability remains, more can be said about the ways this affects an outer perspective, as it goes from screen to screen with barely any movement, no real in-between to the point that space in the same room can start to feel like different spaces. This creates a wholly original sensation, but one that has to be struggled through more often than not, vastly undermining the ways a player extends themselves into the motions of an avatar by heavily limiting movement to a disorienting degree. The slow rotation and straightforward walking of the central character is almost detracting to the point of being intentional, going directly against the ways a player becomes enveloped in a virtual world to spark confusion. Luckily, this was a decision that helped accentuate an intended perception of the series. It's much more stressful. Accentuating the separate ideals of the game and its player creates a feeling that could have been unheard of in the medium beforehand. It produces a real sense of tension, leading this struggle to be a sort of benefit. You're supposed to distance yourself from this movement, as an assumed connection through control keeps you invested, all while being parallel with this avatar injects you with a sense of fear that feels personal. Resident Evil has long since outgrown this practice, even going back on certain decisions with more open remakes. But we see an ever-important challenge here, where certain results will only ever emerge through experimentation. While these choices may seem baffling, they serve a purpose of shaping the overall product, proposing a new way of viewing and confronting its constructed challenges, inevitably poking at this larger distinction between what is seen and what is not. If anything, Resident Evil emphasizes the changes that have become necessary in games going forward, and the importance placed on giving players a way to map out spaces in their mind as they go through them. Games start to offer a closer connection to players that could only arise through the painful progression of rushing into a 3D space. But along the way we see promising output, whether it's the conscious elaboration of what these experiences have influenced, or a dangerous kind of curiosity that has pushed progress into unexpected venues. Each has been essential in establishing gaming and its greater effects through movement, whether it's in how space is structured, or to what extent it's able to be moved throughout. These things offer intricacies that will only branch out with more titles invested in elaborating on these elements, while refining its rough edges. Literally. This was all to a greater benefit, as the medium starts to find a stride past its foundational period, rising out of a proverbial rubble to begin a pure process of building itself back up again. Hey, again, thanks for making it all the way to the end. I would even say I'm impressed. But self-deprecation after such an extensive process is too predictable. I've got just a few more things to say before we end though. This video was a massive undertaking, and of course, probably not the best subject to start off on. So expect quite a few smaller pieces in the near future, just so that I'm not stuck in one space for so long, since it can be pretty mentally draining. I can't wait to finish up the last half, because yes, this is just the halfway point. It's recorded and ready to edit, but I've also got so much more I want to talk about as well, which I've been putting off just to finish this. I've learned a lot in this time too, which I'm sure you can see as the video goes along, only in good ways though. Definitely. So I can guarantee there won't be as long of a wait next time. Hopefully not. Please let me know your thoughts as well. If there's something you'd be curious to hear more about, or if the weird little ways I tend to describe things left you a little lost. I'd be happy to see where I can improve after all. Again, thanks again. And I'll see you later.